The room smells like photocopier toner and institutional carpet cleaner. I am sitting at a mahogany table wide enough to park a car on. Inside Conference Room 14C, on the 14th floor of the Thurgood Marshall Federal Courthouse, and the man across from me. The man in the $6 zeros in suit and the Patek Philippe that cost more than my first apartment, is beginning to realize something is wrong. His name is Harrison Cole Vantage, CEO of Vantage Meridian Capital, a hedge fund that manages, at its peak, $2.3 billion in institutional assets. And he is staring at a manila envelope I have just slid across the table. His lawyer reaches for it first. Vantage waves him off. He opens it himself. There are 47 pages inside. He gets to page 3. The color doesn't drain from his face. It doesn't happen that fast, and this isn't a movie. What happens instead is more interesting. His jaw tightens. His nostrils flare, just slightly. He sets the papers down with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who is trying very hard to appear as though nothing has happened. Then he looks up at me, and I look back at him. I don't say a word. Because here's the thing about that moment, and the reason I'm telling you this story, I had been preparing for it for exactly 211 days. Every document in that envelope was a timestamp. Every timestamp was a lie he had told. And every lie was now the property of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. To understand how one of Wall Street's most celebrated fund managers destroyed himself in 60 seconds of reading, we need to go back to a Tuesday morning in October when he called me into his office and told me I was fired. My name is not important. What I did is, for 4 years and 7 months, I was a derivatives compliance analyst at Vantage Meridian Capital. I want you to understand what that title actually means before you picture someone fetching coffee and filing TPS reports. Derivatives compliance is the function that stands between a fund and prison. It is the analyst who reads the trade authorization chain, every approval, every timestamp, every digital signature, and certifies that what happened in the market matches what the internal record says happened. It is, in plain English, the person who makes sure the paperwork is honest. I was good at it. Better than good. In my second year, I flagged a series of delta hedging positions that would have triggered a Regulations A-show violation and exposed the fund to an 8-figure penalty. My supervisor, a cautious man named Gerald O'Cake, walked the findings upstairs himself. The fund avoided the fine. Nobody said my name at the all-hands meeting when they announced the close call had been managed internally. I didn't expect them to. That was the culture at Vantage Meridian Capital. The analysts produced, the executives performed. And at the top of that performance hierarchy, alone on a throne built from other people's work, sat Harrison Cole Vantage. Vantage was the kind of man who had been told he was brilliant so many times by so many people whose livelihoods depended on him believing it that the flattery had become structural, like rebar poured into concrete. It wasn't arrogance anymore. It was architecture. He walked through the trading floor with the unhurried confidence of someone who genuinely believed the floor existed because he had willed it into being. He had a habit, and I watched him do this dozens of times, of pausing beside an analyst's workstation, glancing at their screen, and saying something like, "Interesting approach," in a tone that made it clear he found it neither interesting nor an approach worth taking. Then he would walk away before anyone could respond. He had never learned a junior employee's last name, not once. In 4.5 years, had he used mine. The fund had been posting strong returns on a suite of interest rate derivatives, long-dated swaptions, primarily through the first 3 quarters of that year. The positions were aggressive but within mandate. The compliance calendar was clean. The board was pleased. Vantage was photographed at a charity auction in the Hamptons for a magazine profile subtitled, simply, "The Architect." Then the Federal Reserve moved. On a Wednesday afternoon in early September, the Fed's policy committee issued a surprise guidance adjustment, not a rate hike, but a hawkish forward statement that the market hadn't priced. The yield curve moved 11 basis points in 40 minutes. 11 basis points doesn't sound like much. On a notional derivatives book of $480 million, it is a catastrophe in slow motion. The fund's swaption positions began hemorrhaging mark-to-market losses within the hour. By the close of business that day, the unrealized loss on the book was staggering. By the following Monday, the institutional clients who had allocated to the rate strategy were calling the investor relations line with a specific, quiet, dangerous tone. The tone that precedes redemptions. The tone that precedes investigations. I learned about the scale of it on a Thursday morning when I was summoned, not asked, summoned, through a junior assistant who appeared at my desk and said, "Harrison would like to see you." without looking up from her own screen, to Vantage's corner office on the 32nd floor. The office had a view of lower Manhattan that felt almost pornographic in its abundance. Vantage was standing at the window when I came in, hands clasped behind his back, watching a container ship move through the harbor. He did not turn around when I entered. He let me stand there for approximately 45 seconds, I counted. When he did turn around, there were two other people in the room I hadn't noticed. Marcus Ree, the fund's chief risk officer, and a woman I had never seen before who had the particular stillness of outside legal counsel. Vantage looked at me the way you look at a vending machine when it fails to dispense what you paid for. "The rate book," he said. "Walk me through your sign-off on the authorization chain." I walked him through it. Every approval in the compliance system bore a timestamp, a digital certificate, and my certification flag. It was clean. I had reviewed the position limits, the mandate parameters, and the counterparty's exposure documentation before each batch of trades went out. Everything had cleared. Vantage nodded slowly. "Your sign-offs were late," he said. I told him they weren't. "The timestamps were in the system." "The timestamps," he said, "reflect a compliance review that was inadequate for the position size. The fund's exposure exceeded your certified limits by a factor that, frankly, suggests you either didn't understand what you were reviewing or you didn't read it." I went very still. I told him that the position limits had been amended in an internal memo circulated 3 weeks prior, signed off at the executive level, and that my certification reflected the amended parameters. Vantage smiled then. It was a small smile, patient and vaguely contemptuous, the smile of a man who has already decided the conversation's outcome and is simply tolerating its duration. "The memo you're referencing," he said, "is an internal discussion document. It doesn't constitute a formal authorization revision. You know that, or you should." He paused. "You were just a junior analyst," he said, not cruelly, almost gently. "The way you explain something to a child who is only now discovering the world doesn't work the way they thought. The position responsibility chain doesn't run through your desk. It never did. We're going to need to restructure who absorbs the documentation liability on this." The woman with the legal stillness was writing something on a yellow legal pad. Ree was looking at the floor. "I'm going to have to let you go," Vantage said. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. HR will be in touch about the standard severance terms." He turned back to the window. The container ship was still moving. I had not yet received the performance bonus I had earned for flagging that Regulation ESHO violation 18 months earlier. Under the fund's compensation structure, it was tied to the quarterly cycle. The quarter had not yet closed. I left the building 22 minutes later with a cardboard box and the quiet, clean feeling of a woman who has just been told a lie she intends to prove. He thought I was going to disappear. That is what people like Harrison Vantage expect from people like me. That we will absorb the blame, collect whatever crumbs are offered, and retreat. But there was something he didn't know yet. Something about his own compliance system. The narrative Vantage Meridian Capital released to the financial press was elegant in its economy. The fund had experienced significant mark-to-market volatility as a result of unexpected macro policy shifts. The derivatives exposure had been managed within the fund's established risk parameters. Restructuring was ongoing. A junior-level compliance function had been discontinued as part of an effort to elevate oversight protocols. Discontinued. That's what you call a person when you're trying to make them into a footnote. The trade publications ran with it. Most of them led with the macro angle, the Fed surprise, the yield curve, the broader dislocation in the rates market. Vantage gave one brief comment to a financial wire service, measured and authoritative. This was a macro environment that challenged even the most sophisticated positioning strategies. "We remain confident in our process and our people." His LinkedIn connection count increased by approximately 400 in the following week. 3 venture capital funds invited him to speak at conferences. The story of what had actually happened, what the compliance record actually showed, was not the story anyone was telling. I was not surprised. I had watched enough postmortems in that industry to know that the narrative always flows toward the entity that controls the documentation. And Vantage Meridian Capital controlled all of the documentation. Or so he believed. I spent the first 2 weeks after my termination doing what anyone does after a sudden firing. The mechanical grief of it, updating a resume, notifying contacts, fielding the calls that come in the first few days, expressions of sympathy edged with the faint, uncomfortable curiosity of people trying to determine whether my fall was contagious. I did not tell anyone what I suspected. I did not, in those first 2 weeks, do anything that could be characterized as investigation. I cleaned my apartment, I read. I slept more than I had in 4 years. And then, on a Sunday evening, 14 days after I was escorted out of the building, I opened my personal laptop and navigated to the secure encrypted backup I had maintained, lawfully under the fund's data retention policy, which permitted analysts to retain personal copies of compliance work product for professional reference of my own certification files. It was a habit I had developed early in my career, not out of suspicion. Out of a professional training that said, if your work is going to carry your signature, keep a record of what you signed. It was the same instinct that makes an architect photograph the blueprints before handing them to the contractor. I had 6 months of trade authorization chains, timestamps certified, backed up on an encrypted external drive that I kept in a fireproof case in my coat closet. But that's not what I was looking at on that Sunday evening. What I was looking at was the fund's own compliance portal login, or rather, the digital breadcrumb it had left behind. Here is something about financial compliance systems that most people outside the industry don't know. Enterprise-grade trade authorization platforms don't just log what was submitted, they log who accessed the system, from which IP address, at what time, using which session token, and, critically, whether any record was modified after its initial creation. Every modification generates a new timestamp, appended invisibly to the record's metadata trail, like a palimpsest. A document can look clean on its face and carry, in its underlying architecture, a complete history of every time someone reached in and changed it. The fund used a platform called Veritas Core, a compliance system common to mid-sized institutional funds, with a cloud architecture that included an automatic mirror log synced to an off-site backup server every 6 hours. I had worked in Veritas Core for 4.5 years. I knew it the way a musician knows an instrument, not just what it produced, but how it produced it. I knew, for instance, that the mirror log sync didn't just capture the document state. It captured the full modification event record. And I knew that the fund had provisioned me as a senior compliance analyst with read-only access to the mirror log server. A quiet administrative permission that no one had thought to revoke when they walked me out of the building. On that Sunday evening, I logged into the mirror server. I was not looking for anything specific. I was simply looking. I found it in 40 minutes, buried in the modification history of the trade authorization record for the 480 million swaption batch. The record that bore my certification flag, the record that Vantage had characterized as inadequately reviewed, was a metadata entry that should not have existed. The record had been modified, not when I certified it, not on the day of the trade, not in any window that corresponded to normal compliance workflow. It had been modified 11 days after the Federal Reserve statement, 11 days after the losses had crystallized, 11 days after the narrative about inadequate junior oversight had already begun to form. The modification was subtle, a single field adjustment in the authorization approval column, changing the source of the executive sign-off from one user ID to another. The change was 5 characters wide. On its face, it meant nothing. What it meant, in context, was everything. He thought he had sealed the record, tiddied the authorization chain, positioned the liability exactly where he wanted it. He didn't realize that Veritas Core's mirror server had seen everything, and he didn't realize that I still had the keys. I want to be precise with you about what the next 200 days actually looked like, because in the telling of stories like this, there is always a temptation to glamorize the investigation, to make it feel like a thriller, with dramatic revelations arriving at convenient intervals and the protagonist moving through the evidence with the confidence of someone who already knows where they're going. That is not what it was. It was patient. It was methodical. It was, at its core, deeply boring in the way that all precise and consequential work is boring, not because it lacked stakes, but because the demanded that I move slowly enough to be certain of every step before I took the next one. I did not go to the SEC on day 15. I did not call a journalist. I did not hire a lawyer until I was 80 days in and had something concrete, enough to explain to one without sounding like a disgruntled former employee with a grudge and a theory. What I did in those first weeks was build the complete evidentiary architecture of what I was looking at. And to do that, I had to understand exactly what Harrison Vantage had done, not in broad strokes, but with the kind of specificity that would survive a cross-examination by someone who had been paid $900 an hour specifically to dismantle it. The modification I had found on the Sunday evening was one data point, One data point is a curious oddity. I needed a pattern. I began with the Veritas Core mirror logs, pulling every modification event for the swaption authorization chain across a 90-day window surrounding the trade dates. I exported the raw metadata to a local database, legal, under my retained access permissions, and wrote a simple Python script to parse the event records by timestamp, user ID, and field change type. The script took 11 minutes to run. What it returned took 11 days to fully understand. There were not 1 modifications. There were 14 distinct modification events spread across a 9-day window, beginning 3 days after the Federal Reserve statement and ending 2 days before the fund's first regulatory response filing, a suspicious activity report analog submitted to FINRA as part of standard post-loss protocol. Each modification was small. No single change, viewed in isolation, would have drawn attention. The authorization approval field, a date of receipt entry, the digital signature pathway attribution, each one adjusted, each one creating a version of the document that looked, in current display, like a clean and properly authorized trade record, with one crucial difference. In the original version, the version I had certified, the executive sign-off in the authorization chain bore Vantage's own user ID. He had personally approved the position parameters the morning of the trade, his credentials, his session token, his digital thumbprint. In the modified version, the sign-off pathway had been rerouted. The modification mapped the approval attribution through an intermediate function, the very compliance review layer that bore my certification flag. The effect was to make it appear to any subsequent reader of the current record that the position had cleared through compliance review without having received a direct executive authorization. That the analyst layer had, in essence, approved something that hadn't gone through the top. It was, in the language of securities regulation, a falsification of material records related to a trade authorization. Under Section 17 of the Securities Exchange Act, under SEC Rule 17A4, and, depending on the intent demonstrated, potentially under the Federal Criminal Code governing fraud in connection with securities transactions. He had not eliminated the original approval. He had buried it. The mirror server's log structure preserved it. The pre-modification state, the session data for the modification event, the IP address that had initiated the change, and the user account that had carried it out. The IP address resolved to Vantage Meridian Capital's internal network. The user account was registered to Harrison Cole Vantage. I printed nothing. I maintained everything in encrypted digital form with cryptographic hash verification, a method that establishes that a file has not been altered since a specific point in time, creating a legally defensible chain of custody. I had learned this from a continuing education seminar on forensic document review I had attended voluntarily 2 years earlier. The fund had not paid for that seminar. I had. At day 80, I retained an attorney. Her name was Cecilia Park, and she ran a boutique practice focused on securities whistleblower matters. She had a reputation in the field for the particular quality most useful in this kind of work. She did not get excited. I walked her through the evidence in a 3-hour meeting at her office. She asked clarifying questions throughout. Precise, technical questions about the log architecture, the access provisioning, the modification event structure. She did not write anything down for the first hour. She listened. At the end of the 3rd hour, she looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they were hoping wouldn't be confirmed. "This is real," she said. She wasn't talking to me. She was processing. She pulled out a legal pad. "We're going to file a whistleblower submission with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower," she said. "Under Dodd-Frank Section 21F, you are eligible for between 10 and 30% of any sanction that exceeds $1 million collected from the respondents." She paused. "If the evidence supports what the logs suggest, the sanction will exceed $1 million by several orders of magnitude." I told her that wasn't why I was doing it. She nodded. "I know," she said. "But I'm telling you anyway, because it changes the legal strategy, and you deserve to know what you're entitled to." She tapped her pen on the pad. "Now, tell me about the board vote." I told her what I had discovered 3 weeks earlier, in the fund's published governance calendar, which was public record under its investment. Advisor registration. The Vantage Meridian Capital Board was scheduled to vote in 31 days on an indemnification resolution. A board vote to grant key executives, including the CEO, legal cost indemnification for any regulatory action arising from the September trading losses. If that resolution passed before our submission was filed, it would not stop the investigation. but it would significantly complicate the fund's ability to cooperate. And it would trigger a cascade of self-protective legal positioning that would make the evidence harder to deploy cleanly. We had 31 days. Cecilia looked at her legal pad, then back at me. Then we have 31 days, she said. She was already writing. There is a specific kind of work that happens in the final phase before a formal legal action. A period that doesn't have a dramatic name, that doesn't announce itself, that looks from the outside like nothing at all. Meetings in law offices, documents organized into numbered tabs, phone calls made in careful language, forms completed with obsessive attention to phrasing. This is the phase where cases are won or lost, weeks before anyone walks into a room. Cecilia and her associate, a meticulous younger attorney named Danielle Mercer, spent the first week of our 31-day window doing what she called fortifying the perimeter. This meant anticipating every counter-argument, every procedural challenge, every avenue of dismissal that Vantage's eventual legal team would attempt, and sealing each one before the submission was filed. The first fortification was chain of custody. Every piece of evidence I had gathered needed to be established as legally obtained, unaltered, and properly documented. Cecilia retained a forensic digital evidence consultant, a former FBI Cyber Division examiner named Barrows, who I never met in person, but who submitted a 12-page affidavit certifying the cryptographic integrity of my exported mirror log files. Barrows confirmed that the hash values I had recorded at the time of export matched the current state of the files, meaning they had not been touched since I had collected them. The modification event logs were, in his professional language, forensically intact. The second fortification was access legitimacy. Cecilia had a technology law specialist review the fund's data access policy and my original provisioning documentation to confirm, in a written memorandum, that my read-only access to the Veritas Core Mirror server had been legally granted, had never been formally revoked, and that my use of it to export the metadata for professional compliance reference purposes fell within the scope of the access grant. This was not a trivial exercise. It took 4 days and a subpoena-resistant legal opinion. But it meant that no one could later argue I had obtained the evidence through unauthorized access. The whistleblower statute's protection depends, in part, on how the evidence was acquired. The third fortification was documentation completeness. Danielle Mercer spent 6 days building what he called the exhibit spine, a chronologically organized, cross-reference package of every piece of evidence, with a master index that allowed any reviewer to navigate from any claim to its underlying support in under 30 seconds. He was finicky about it in the way that very good attorneys are finicky about documents. Not aesthetically, but structurally, because he understood that an SEC examiner reading a whistleblower submission at speed would either follow the thread of evidence immediately or discard it. There is no middle ground. The submission package, when complete, was 241 pages. The core allegation was 11 pages. The remaining 230 pages were support. On day 22 of our 31-day window, Cecilia filed the formal whistleblower submission with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower through the agency's TCR portal. It was a Monday. She submitted it at 9:14 in the morning. She texted me a single word when it was done. Filed. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I looked at the word on my screen for a moment, then set the phone face down on the table. That was not the end. That was the beginning of the end, which is a different thing entirely, and requires a different quality of patience. What happened in the following 9 days, days 23 through 31 before the board vote, was, from my vantage point, almost entirely invisible. The SEC does not notify subjects of whistleblower submissions. The fund did not know it had been reported. Vantage continued to give interviews. An industry publication named him one of the year's most influential alternative investment managers. He attended a panel discussion at a financial conference in Midtown and spoke for 45 minutes about the importance of institutional risk culture. But Cecilia had done one more thing alongside the SEC filing. On the advice of a former federal prosecutor she had consulted informally, she had submitted a referral, not a formal complaint, but a structured informational referral, to the DOJ's Securities and Corporate Fraud Task Force, flagging the modification event evidence and its potential overlap with federal obstruction and falsification statutes. The referral did not trigger immediate action. It wasn't designed to. It was designed to create a parallel awareness at the federal criminal level so that when the SEC's examination began, the DOJ would already be oriented to the matter. and could coordinate rather than discover. This is the part of legal strategy that doesn't make it into the popular imagination. The infrastructure of an action, built before the action begins, so that when the moment arrives, every authority that needs to be moving is already in motion. On day 28, Cecilia received a communication from the SEC's Enforcement Division. I will not characterize its contents in detail, beyond saying that it indicated the submission had been reviewed and that the examination process had been initiated. She called me from her office at 6:47 in the evening. "The board vote is in 3 days," I said. "I know," she said. "We're going to the deposition." I asked her what she's meant. She explained. The funds board had scheduled a formal governance session for the indemnification vote to be held in a conference room at their law firm's offices. Under the fund's governance charter, the session was technically open to any party with a documented material interest in the outcome. My terminated employment and the disputed compliance documentation attached to it constituted a documented material interest. Cecilia had prepared a motion of intervention. She had also, through a separate channel, arranged for an SEC examiner to be present at the session in an observer capacity, on the basis of the pending enforcement matter. She had also arranged for a court reporter. I asked her what I needed to bring. "The envelope," she said. I had 47 pages already printed, already assembled, already in order. 47 pages, 211 days. The night before the deposition, I sat at my kitchen table and read through the entire package from the first page to the last. I did this not because I needed to review it. I had memorized every exhibit, every timestamp, every session token. I did it because it was the last quiet moment I was going to have, and I wanted to use it well. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept without difficulty. He still had no idea what was coming. I arrived at conference room 14C at 8:42 in the morning, 18 minutes before the scheduled start. Cecilia was already there. Daniel Faro was setting up at the far end of the table, arranging the exhibit binders in the order we had agreed on. The court reporter was calibrating her equipment in the corner. The SEC examiner, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and a briefcase she had not yet opened, was seated 2 chairs from the head of the table, reviewing something on a tablet. The room was clean and institutional and completely without drama. That is what real consequential moments look like. They don't look like movies. They look like Tuesday mornings. Harrison Vantage's legal team arrived at 8:58. 4 of them. The lead counsel was a senior partner from a midtown firm, whose name I recognized from regulatory defense filings I had reviewed professionally. He was competent and careful, and he would have been very useful to Vantage if we had been fighting over something that could be argued. We were not. We were fighting over timestamps. Timestamps do not argue back. Vantage himself arrived at 9:03. He came through the door with the forward momentum of a man who treats every room as a room he has already won. His suit was charcoal, perfectly fitted. His watch caught the fluorescent light. He scanned the room in under 2 seconds, a practiced, instinctive read, and his gaze landed on me. A flicker. I want to be accurate about this. It was not fear, not yet. It was the brief recalibration of a man who expected to see a grievance, not a setup. He sat at the opposite end of the table from me. His lead counsel leaned in and murmured something close to his ear. Vantage shook his head slightly. The session's stated purpose was the governance review of the indemnification resolution. Cecilia's intervention motion had reframed it as a proceeding with disputed evidentiary elements requiring review before any vote could be held. This had been contested. His legal team had filed an objection the previous afternoon, and the objection had been denied on the grounds that the SEC's observer presence indicated pending enforcement interest sufficient to pause any indemnity action that might affect the fund's regulatory posture. His lawyers had not expected the SEC presence. Their objection filing had not accounted for it. That was the first crack. Not a visible one, but I could see it in the way his lead counsel sat. The particular quality of stillness that comes from recalculating under pressure. Cecilia opened the session with a statement of purpose, measured and spare. There was disputed material evidence concerning the fund's trade authorization records and the compliance documentation attached to the September derivatives loss event. The evidence bore directly on both the indemnification resolution before the board and on matters currently under examination by the Securities and Exchange Commission. She nodded to me. I slid the envelope across the table. Vantage reached for it before his lawyer could. I want to remember that detail, because it was the most revealing thing he did in that room. He still believed, at that moment, that whatever was in the envelope was something he could manage, something he could read, and then characterize, and then explain. He had spent a career turning documents into narratives, and he was so confident in that ability that he opened it himself. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet, when the people in them have stopped pretending to do something else and are simply waiting. He read the first page, the summary exhibit overview, 1 page, 17 bullet points, each one a modification event with its timestamp, user ID, session token, and field change. He read it in approximately 40 seconds. He turned to page 2, the first raw modification log, with the pre- and post-date comparison for the authorization field. He read it in less time than the first page. His reading was slowing down. He turned to page 3. Page 3 was the session token resolution, the technical document from the forensic examiner Barrows, establishing that the session token associated with the modification events resolved to a workstation registered under Vantage's executive credentials on the fund's internal network during business hours on a day when building access records showed Vantage had badged in at 7:44 in the morning and out at 8:17 in the evening. He set the pages down. His lead counsel took them. He read faster than his client. He was trained to. His read was diagnostic, not absorptive. I watched him get to page 3 and then page 4, and then pull out his own legal pad and write a single line. He did not show it to Vantage. The SEC examiner had opened her briefcase. She removed a folder. She did not look up. Cecilia spoke again. She laid out, in 7 minutes of uninterrupted, carefully sequenced narrative, exactly what the evidence established. That Harrison Vantage had accessed the fund's compliance system 11 days after the Federal Reserve statement, during the window when the fund was constructing its regulatory response narrative. That he had modified the trade authorization record for the $480 million swaption batch to reroute the approval attribution away from his own user credentials and toward the compliance review layer bearing my certification flag. That the purpose of the modification was to shift apparent regulatory liability downward onto a junior analyst who had already been terminated and who was no longer in a position to contest the record in real time, and that the modification violated Section 17 of the Securities Exchange Act, SEC Rule 17A-4's record preservation requirements, and constituted potential securities fraud under Section 10 and Rule 10b-5. She noted that the whistleblower submission had been filed 22 days prior and that the SEC's examination was active. She noted that the indemnification resolution before the board, if passed, would represent a fund action taken with direct knowledge of pending enforcement activity, and that the board members present should consider their own fiduciary exposure in voting on such a resolution. She paused. Then she said, "The evidence has been submitted directly to the Commission's Enforcement Division. A copy of the submission, including all exhibits, is in the envelope Mr. Vantage is holding." The room was completely silent. Vantage's jaw was working slightly, as though he was trying to formulate a sentence and finding that the words for it did not exist. His lead counsel put a hand on his arm, a brief, practiced gesture, the kind that says, "Do not speak, do not move, do not give them anything they don't already have." The board members who had assembled for the indemnification vote were seated along the room's far wall. 3 of them. One of them, a woman in her 60s who chaired the audit committee, had her reading glasses on and was looking at the exhibit summary Cecilia had distributed at the start of the session. She had not looked up since. The indemnification vote did not happen that morning. The board chair requested a 30-day delay pending legal review. He made the request in the flat, careful voice of a man who has just realized that the room he walked into was not the room he thought it was. His request was noted by the court reporter. I looked at Vantage. It was the only time I looked directly at him in that room with any deliberateness, not with anger, not with satisfaction in any way that I would call pleasure. With the simple, clear-eyed acknowledgement of a woman who spent 211 days being absolutely certain, looking at a man who had just run out of the only currency he had ever trusted, the assumption that other people's records could be made to say whatever he needed them to say. He did not look back at me. His legal team requested a brief recess at 9:41. It was granted. Cecilia gathered her papers in the quiet, efficient way of someone who had just done what she came to do. Daniel Farrow was already collating the return copies of the exhibit binders. The court reporter was noting the recess time. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. In the hallway outside conference room 14C, the fluorescent light was the same quality as inside. The HVAC system hummed. Someone from another floor had left a cart of coffee service by the elevator bank, 2 silver thermoses, a small stack of paper cups, a bowl of sugar packets. I poured a cup of coffee. It was the first coffee I had enjoyed in 7 months. The investigation that followed is public record. I will not narrate its details beyond what you can find in the SEC's enforcement release, which was published 5 months after that morning, and which uses the phrase falsification of material compliance records in its opening paragraph. The financial penalty was significant. The indemnification resolution failed to pass at any subsequent board session. Harrison Cole Vantage resigned as CEO of Vantage Meridian Capital on a Wednesday afternoon, the same day of the week, as it happened, that the Federal Reserve had issued the guidance statement that had started all of this. I received the Whistleblower Award 18 months later. I have used part of it to fund a securities compliance training program for junior analysts at mid-size funds. The kind of analysts who, statistically, are the most likely to be handed a pen and told to sign something they didn't write. The program is called the Timestamped Initiative. I named it that because the thing that Vantage never understood, the thing that arrogance of his specific variety always misses, is that in a digital system nothing is ever truly erased. The record of what you did persists in the architecture, patient and indifferent, waiting for someone to know where to look. I knew where to look. He never thought to ask.